Hello. This is an addendum to the presidential lecture that I gave to the Institute of Andean Studies meeting in January of 2023. To be honest, I ran out of time to cover everything that I was interested in talking about. And so given the flexibilities of remote lectures and posting to the web, I'm taking advantage to finish that lecture and include some material that I think is really quite important that I couldn't get to. So let me continue from, roughly speaking, where I was. I present you this image of Chavin de Huántar. It's an overhead view, a map, which is designed to show primarily the underground systems brought up to date. Almost all of them are present. The red and the yellow items in this map are the galleries currently known. And there are a few missing, but they're in sort of the outlying buildings. The blue lines are the canals, the canal system of Chavin. And as I mentioned at the start, these are very different. And in fact, you may note that there is an exceptional tendency for the canals to never get very close to the galleries. They generally don't pass over or under a gallery. And in the few cases where they would have, they were rerouted. And the older segment of the canal, typically underneath a new gallery being put in place, was rerouted to be far away from there. Galleries were never meant to be wet. And canals clearly were, with the sediments that we find in them and the fact that they head for the rivers as their drainage points. Now, I've been talking about a series of galleries thus far and emphasizing that galleries were probably a way, among other things, of reaching back into the past to actually access architecture, which because of the growth of the buildings, both lateral and vertical, ended up being underground, but really not so much underground as within the structure of the buildings. So I will return to that theme at the very end, but it's, I think, very important to realize that Chavin seems to be time transgressive. It seems to be interested in bringing the past into the present or making the past accessible or real and very much tangible. So that's a pattern that we've seen based on at least 4 and probably 5 different systems of galleries within Chavin, wherein old walls that would have been originally surface structures, were incorporated into sometimes quite modified and sometimes less modified layouts as the surface architecture is incorporated into a gallery system. Now, what I would like to do is just show you this image, which is the gallery of the Esplanade. I can show you here in the previous slide, it's this highest red gallery in the image, one that we discovered about 2015. And I just want to point out things, some details of this previous structure that may help make sense out of this. In one case, these walls, which are shown in brown together with gray stones, these walls were found crossing this longest corridor of the gallery, the transversal corridor on the north side of the gallery. And we thought, well, these are ceiling walls which were placed late, probably during abandonment or ritual interment or something like that of the gallery. But as we pursued them and excavated them and cleaned up the union between these walls and the walls of the gallery, we realized that these transcrossing walls are actually previous walls that go on into the matrix beyond the walls of the gallery. In other words, that fill into which the gallery was built effectively. So since they come down to the floor, probably go slightly past the floor, these are previous structures, which ironically and enigmatically are preserved in the form of this gallery. They were not, when we encountered them, they were not complete to the roof, and they showed signs of multiple rebuildings, like they had been taken down, put back up, probably during the life of the gallery, but based on the original structure that they had been from, a surface structure. The actual reason for their permanence, you would think that they would have been taken down because they contradict the gallery structure, or certainly any easy sense of passage within the gallery out to its cells on the two the right and left lateral sides. We think that has a great deal to do with what went on in this gallery, probably isolating people in the cells. We think this is a gallery related to probably sensory deprivation. There's almost nothing found in the gallery itself. On the floor, there is absolutely nothing cultural found on the gallery, in the gallery. And so that seems to be part of a reasonable argument towards that end. But since we're really dealing with this point at old evidence of old structures, down here in the first crossing cells from the gallery entrance, in the right-hand one, you see thicker walls depicted at the right side, and also on the left side. This represents a double-sided wall. We had the privilege, if you will, of cleaning out an intrusion, a post-Chavin intrusion, precisely in that area. And as we did that, coming in from above, we could see that this wall is clearly two-sided. It has two finished faces on it. And gallery walls don't have that. And we realized that the stonework was different, and actually that this had been part of a complex original wall, which had a slight inset into it. And matching it on the far side is a similar two-sided wall. This suggests that the gallery was built within and coordinating with an old structure. These walls actually do sympathize with the gallery layout as it was realized. So we have examples of earlier walls, both contradicting and coinciding with the gallery layout. This is very typical of other galleries that show this early structure. There are probably other things which are quite important. I would just draw your attention to 3 stone-lined cysts. They're vertical. In the case of these, they're primarily circular in layout and somewhat more than half a meter in depth, about 70 centimeters in depth. They go down to a common surface at the base of each of the 3 of them. Their function is enigmatic, but their form is very common, especially in this esplanade area. But we suspect they're more common than people have suspected, because they were not visible on the floor as it was cleared. The clays of the floor had basically paved over them, but they were floor features that had been used during the time of the gallery, but they go down to a common earlier surface. This is something that we're going to be seeing quite often. And so it means to us that within the galleries, it seems probable that there was peering into the past, that these were basically meant make evident earlier surfaces. Now, the floor of the gallery was probably more or less the horizontal, or rather the vertical level of the surface structures whose parts it incorporated. But these little cysts, hoyos, I prefer to call them because the word is somewhat more reasonable in Spanish than in English. These go down to a yet earlier surface. So if we think about the gallery of the Esplanade as an example of gallery backward referencing, it references its own time period by its own existence. It references the time period of construction, the stratigraphic level on which there was an accumulated fill in which the gallery was left as an architectural space by building up walls and incorporating it as that fill was built. And then it has these little wells in time going back to a yet earlier surface. And you might say, well, 3 of these were probably made to a similar standard. So they go back about to the same level. I'll give that as a reasonable alternative conclusion that maybe they're not intentionally going back to the same level. Where I will be going with the upcoming subsequent part of this lecture is we've got up to about 100 of these in some structures going back quite clearly to the same level and to a very recognizable earlier floor. So at any rate, I just wanted to give you an example there of the actual way in which this works. Now, what I'm going to be talking to you about for most of the rest of this time is our excavations in the Esplanade area. The gallery of the Esplanade has its entranceway right in this area, but I'm showing you this at an early stage in our excavations when we were expanding out to this major area, which we increased over time, eventually dominating this area of that major roof, under that major roof, and in the excavated areas which lie between us and that roof in the photograph. So this defines a number of processes: the process of our excavation, the process of conservation, the building of these roofs in order to maintain the excavation open state without being degraded heavily by the annual rainfall that comes here. And that's a considerable effort to build the roofs, to maintain them over time. And it's something that we recognize as a rather temporal thing. These roofs are not going to last very well. We know they don't. In fact, the roof you see in front of you has been replaced twice already. So we're working on the design of roofs which would be more long-lasting, but at the same time, locally sustainable, using, if possible, a lot of local materials or materials that are locally available, and local labor and local expertise. This, I think, is quite important. This is not a lecture on conservation, but I did want to bring conservation into this because it has much to do with what we found in the time after our excavation areas were roofed. Now I'll get to that as it comes, but I just want you to have an image of those roofs expanding, creating a large sheltered area, and obviously having a tendency to dry out sediments. Water is being taken off of them, delivered down roof, as you will, and put into a number of facilities for allowing that water to either enter into canals or go into the sediments of the site in a, shall we say, conservationally gentle fashion. So we did this expansion of the excavation out into the Esplanade area. The building that you see on the left-hand side with its own small roof on top of it is building C. I'm taking this picture from building D, that building into which the Gallery of the Condor was built and which we discovered earlier last year. And so this places us then outside of the major, what I've been calling basins of the monumental center. That is to say, those spaces inside the U-shaped structures. I don't know if they were always U-shaped, but they have that tendency, that have always been considered the center of the site. The circular plaza, the Plaza Mayor, these are those core contained areas, contained spaces, which we assume would have had a great deal of ritual importance. The work in the Esplanade was the opposite. It was an attempt to look at what happens outside of those core areas. We were taking in building C, which at that point we started in 2009, was very little known. Only a few small excavations had been done within it. And as we eventually showed, and I mentioned last time, we discovered a number of gallery systems, both out in the Esplanade and in the building itself. We amplified the knowledge of some previously known galleries. So we were raising a very important question. What happened at Chavin in the internal included basin spaces? What happened outside? Well, obviously, we're only exploring one exterior area, so we can hardly say that everything we found here would have been found in other areas. One of the things that we were most concerned with in this regard is to know whether anything found outside in the spaces on the external face of the buildings, whether it replicated what we had seen or had been historically documented to the degree that documentation was done. In those central ceremonial basins, if you will, were we seeing a pale reflection or even a substantial reflection of the same processes, or were we going to see something rather different in the Chavin period components? Or alternatively, nothing at all. Those external spaces really weren't effectively utilized. So I'm just going to give away the conclusion on that one right away. What we found was, while certain forms of architecture are parallel, such as the Gallery of the Esplanade, galleries exist. It's really rather different. The Gallery of the Esplanade is the only gallery to date whose entry is via a plaza surface. So it's a gallery, yes, it has a different form. It's a little bit lower in height than most other galleries. So there are distinctive characteristics to it, but yet the form does exist, in common with those basins, the ceremonial core of the site, if you will. What we can say is that the great majority of architecture, which I'm now going to be talking about in this large area excavation in the Esplanade, to a great degree, almost all of the architecture encountered, there is a density of architecture that is, well, there's nothing that is not constructed, and there's nothing that wasn't reconstructed dozens of times. One of my big messages here. But yet those architectural forms are really almost totally different than those found in the central core areas of the site, the large plazas, the large terraces. Here, there really isn't open space. It's being constructed to complete coverage of the area and reconstructed constantly. So it's very different. Now, what's the importance of this? Again, I'm going to give this away right now because I won't come back to it in the conclusion. The importance is that if we imagine that Chavin was duplicating its ritual functions both within and outside of those core ceremonial areas, it would at least give a suggestion that if these are contemporaneous, and they clearly are, because almost everything that's documented is black and white phase, i.e. about 850 BC to about 550 BC. So they're clearly overlapping in time. And if they were common in their function, it would hint at the possibility of multiple cults or cultic activities, perhaps between quite parallel units, perhaps some sort of a cooperative of cults forming up a ceremonial center, but not necessarily under a common leadership, perhaps with a certain amount of independence in their function. Certainly would need to be entertained. If they were different in their architecture and the implied functionality being exercised in these two areas, inside and outside of the core areas, it would suggest that it's more probable that there may have been a common functional organization, perhaps led by a common unique leadership, which was supervising and coordinating a broader range of functions in the site. And so it's quite important to see this type of structure, and it's so clearly defined that we can argue that it is clearly the latter. And it suggests that Chavin was, in fact, highly strategized, coordinated, and what have you. So let's now take a closer look at this area. Here, looking down, you can see we're tucked into the corner between building C and building D. This area, particularly concentrating in this reddened central circular area. But to start with, we're going to be looking at the larger area, which shows some of the more major walls and platforms and a dim outline in the dead center here of the underground gallery of the Esplanade. Now, just as a matter of explanation, the reason that we have this architecture so well preserved, although there are substantial platforms of 2 meters and more of height, which are built in front of the north face of building C, primary reference to it, as opposed to building D. Much of the architecture compared to that of, say, the Circular Plaza, the Plaza Mayor, and the other core ritual architecture is lighter duty. The walls are simply less substantial. The surfaces are, in many cases, say, more sensitive, more delicate. And so there's a reasonable question of how were these preserved? And we have to say that there is an exceptional preservation circumstance here, and that is both building C and building D bled deposits over this area after the abandonment of the ceremonial center as it fell into disuse very rapidly around 500 BC, calibrated that these eroding deposits coming down off of the high buildings and also the squatter-like settlements of the subsequent periods of use of the site, which no longer involved themselves in the type of Chavin ritual space use. These very quickly deepening deposits protected this particular area, that is the elbow between edifice building D and building C. So it's an explanation for why, in some ways, we're finding so much here. And it was our particular luck to happen upon these circumstances. Now, the first area we're going to be looking at, which is sort of the broader area to the north and to the west of the Esplanade excavations, was run by Oscar Arias. And I'm pulling quite a bit of information and graphics from his recent thesis at San Marcos, an exceptional document in itself, and want to make sure that he's properly credited for this. He excavated it, he analyzed most of the materials and arranged for the analysis of those materials he didn't personally analyze, synthesized it in a document which would be pretty much equivalent to a PhD dissertation in the United States. In other words, a very substantial and enviable work, a tremendous contribution to our knowledge. So this is the type of area that he was working with. We're now looking towards the south, across the west being off to the right. This western portion of the Esplanade area. And there isn't too much that I can say about this because it's obviously a melange of an immense number of structures, including some remnant post-Chavin ones. Those two darkest pits, stone-lined pits, there's actually a third one here, are actually tombs from the Mariash Requai period, roughly year 0 to about 700 AD. That intruded down into the Chavin platforms and other structures. But visible in this vision are very large numbers of stone-lined pits of a smaller scale, all the way around this central area as we've been excavating downward and starting to leave the stones of those stone-lined pits exposed. These range all the way around here. And it's a spectacular distribution of stone-lined pits. If they weren't stone-lined and if they had any evidence in favor of this, we would perhaps think they were very substantial post holes. But they're not. There's no evidence of any wood having been in that space. The way that they're built and such doesn't make any sense as a post hole. If they were to be post holes, it means that they were built. An arrangement of post holes was built over about 50 to 80 centimeters of vertical growth over a very large space simultaneously. Tremendous post hole planning, I might add. And the unlikelihood of that post hole planning and the fact that we have no evidence of a post-like use for them suggests that there's something else. But I'll get to that more in a second. This at least gives you a vision of the space that was excavated. Now, I'm not going to try to go into too much detail. Here, should have referenced this. Here are some of those pits as they're gradually being exposed as sediments are being excavated from around them. The pits were built during the raising of the ground surface. The stones were installed. These are not stone-lined pits being placed into a larger pit context. They're stones that are being placed in a very dense fill that's being built up. And so they would have, their time of use, if you will, or visibility, would have been at this upper level of the stones. You can see a slight gleam in this central pit, and that is part of a valve of, I believe, Mytilus in that particular case. But for the most part, these pits, even though they very occasionally had marine shell in them, I think maybe 2 out of about 80 pits had that, they are otherwise absolutely content-free in terms of any sort of artifactual material. But they have a very common lower level. This is just to illustrate that. These are the sorts of cross-sections you would see for those pits, leading down to a floor of, in this particular case, this is the section going through a rectangularly defined space, which is part of this large arrangement of hoyos. You can see that the cross-section goes through part of it, that open rectangular space, and then through 2 lateral hoyos on either side. The EA37 surface here that they're going down to is the most concrete-like floor I have personally ever witnessed in the Andes. It's a beautifully made, very flat, almost polished floor, which when it's dry is hard as a rock. And these pits go down to it consistently. So we will deal with that as we come. But here is sort of part of that arrangement before we had fully excavated it. You can see that the pits, stone-lined pits, are in rectangular formation. This one is virtually square. And we see the beginnings of another one, which had been to a fair degree destroyed by the lack of the heavy cover of eroding sediments coming down from building C here in the upper left-hand corner. So the preservation of the structure was much poorer as we went away from the building. But it represented three contemporary rectangular arrangements of these hoyos. And at either extreme, we actually did get some more detail as we continued downward here. At either extreme, two rows of hoyos, if you will, are found on either side of a wall coming off of this previous cement-like surface. The hoyos could not have served any reasonable purpose in supporting that wall, but they are clearly observing and respecting that wall. There's a whole series of reasons to believe that the hoyos are marking something that was on this surface, perhaps a structure itself, maybe a temporary surface, or some sort of a ritual space. It's going to great efforts to do this, but right now it has no other explanation other than to mark a layout of something happening on that earlier surface, probably a surface dating back about 200 years earlier than this surface from which the hoyos were being used, however that might have been done. Something else that was found here very clearly was that an intrusive excavation had been done in this rather irregular shaped areas, coming down from the surface of that upper level of use of the hoyos. It comes down, reveals that lower floor, and in an orderly way was refilled. So it has that hole, as far as we can tell, there was nothing left behind in the way of an offering. The only thing it did was reveal a much larger extent of this earlier floor and then seal it again. This turns out to be not a very unusual thing for this area. And what I'm trying to hint at here is that there is a backwards vision, not only in the galleries in terms of incorporating earlier walls and sending these hoyos down to yet earlier surfaces, but in open air contexts, such as this one, this is being done as well. Earlier surfaces are being sought, they're being observed, they're being exposed and made evident in a pattern of activity that I find very, very striking. So just quickly, for the area we've been looking at, roughly similar to what we see here at about the same position, there are a series of large platforms, and Oscar Arias's work revealed a great deal about them, especially on their northern end. Platform 2 is roughly speaking the area and time we've been looking at. And new platforms are built over time. Canals, small water canals, surface canals, are being built and rebuilt and moved about. New walls are being built. New passageways are starting to show up. Now we have new pits, stone-lined pits showing up in some relationship with a rebuilding of this canal and rerouting of it more to the north. We start to see major defining walls that are large enough to delimit the platforms, which themselves are expanding out, having sub-platforms on their surface, staircases accessing them, and a whole series of features that are not shown here. Over time, we see a tremendous pattern of growth and reuse of the site. Now, this is at a very large scale. We're just talking about the major features, and the use of this space has changed over this period of time, which is about 300 years as I've shown it. We're entirely within the black and white phase, and the intensity of large-scale restructuring of this space is quite high. That's also happening across the time that the gallery, the local gallery and its subsidiary incorporated galleries of Mirador and Capilla, one of the galleries that we found and had been suspected by Teo, but as far as we can tell, Teo probably never saw any part of it, nor was it accessible in his time period. He was basically projecting a symmetry between the known Mirador gallery and the Capilla gallery, and he was right. His dotted outline of a possible gallery in this area is reasonably close to what we found. But at any rate, across the time of the expansion of Oscar Arias' structures down here on the Esplanade, these galleries have been evolving, as has been the gallery of the Esplanade, which at this time period is completely closed off. This is pretty close to the end of the black and white phase. That gallery, the only evidence that we have is that a small pit, stone-lined pit, has been preserved through a rising plaza floor coming right down to the entrance of the gallery, marking the gallery where it had been. And we do have evidence of intrusion into the gallery after it is abandoned in the Chavin period, and it starts accumulating very fine sediments that are coming primarily from a surface canal that is draining through the roof and bringing these fine sediments in. I think given the fact that there's entry into the gallery and some small but very interesting offerings are being placed into that sediment increase, as the sediments actually come up and rise to near the roof, all within the Chavin period, it seems likely that people were quite aware that their canals, routing water across on top of this gallery, an exceptional thing to do, even with a small canal, may have been quite intentional. And they may have been sedimenting in the gallery for reasons that we don't understand. But nonetheless, there is a complex relationship, as in this gallery sequence. Up here, what looks like an entrance down into an underground space indeed is. It's a sort of half gallery. It was roofed with long roofing beams of a relatively thin nature, some of which remained in place to our excavation and still are there today. But it seems that it in some ways may have been capable of replacing this gallery of the Esplanade, at a higher level as our overall surface level is continuing to rise. What is fascinating, and I'll show you in a later image, but I just want to illustrate it here at this scale, is that this gallery, this half gallery, whatever in the heck it was, but it's gallery-like, was countersunk down to an earlier floor. They excavated down to find an earlier floor to use for this new gallery structure. So not only are they including available surface architecture into their galleries, they're actually going out of their way to excavate down to earlier surfaces to incorporate into their galleries as well. This transtemporality, time transgression, to my mind, is as evidently intentional as anything that we found of a material nature at Chavin. It's very clear this is going on. Now, let me clarify something that I hinted at earlier. Our roofs dried out the sediments underneath them. For the most part, we tended to work under unroofed, in unroofed conditions because of the better lighting that we had, and also because when the areas were unroofed, getting through the rainy seasons by covering the architecture exposed and also then putting a conservation layer on top of the immediate sediments. Those surfaces remained wet, damp overall, and our excavation was very much facilitated by that softer character of the sediments. We roofed eventually the whole Esplanade area, the whole Esplanade excavation area, and things started to dry out. Well, we expect to leave this excavation more or less as it is, finding particular areas to conserve for touristic visiting, whole series of processes there that we're anticipating and still do, planning for tourism. But new questions came up about surfaces which we had stopped on and minor pockets of sediments that we actually hadn't completed. And we were rather discouraged to say, how are we now going to excavate these quite hard dry deposits? But we launched at it anyways. Here we can see Freddy Melgarejo working with a picota and a trowel in some of these areas. And we found, to our great surprise, in fact, it was a great but elongate surprise, as we began to realize that we could peel layers that were not visible and were not something that we would easily be able to do when these sediments were damp. But rather, we could literally scale floors off, quite often floors no more than 1 centimeter of thickness, and identify a whole series of construction events that we would have missed otherwise. We were re-excavating, not really because we were going into new sediments, but we had taken this excavation, intentionally or not, down to critical Chavin surfaces. But we were able to peel those surfaces, tended as much as we could not to grossly penetrate them and destroy them, but rather pursue from the highest one that we had found, where we generally stopped. We were going down and revealing stages of construction and use of structures in a fashion immensely intensive. Now, just to go back here, I'm going to be talking about an area right here in this sort of southern edge of the Esplanade and at the southeastern edge of major platforms. It isn't because that's the only area where this occurs, this very fine evidence of intensive construction and reconstruction, but rather it's just one that we've happened to work on. And it's one where we think it's quite illustrative, and we're formulating an article on the implications of this architecture and its intensity. Here, seen from the other direction, is the entrance to the gallery of the Esplanade. Its small square stone-lined oyo coming down from above that I've mentioned, the canal coming across it, including with a hole going down into the gallery of the Esplanade here, talked about as a possible sedimentation source. And here's the corner of this large platform complex that I'm going to be talking about. This is prior to the re-excavation. Just want to again recognize that especially the graphics that were drafted and the architectural logic which has been deciphered from this is really the work of Miguel Ortiz, consummate archaeologist and amazing graphic artist. So really what I'm doing is in most ways reporting on his work, although we've spent weeks of hours talking about this and getting increasingly more inspired by what his fieldwork has produced. So what I want to do is present a fairly fast sequence of this corner. See the entrance to the gallery of the Esplanade. You can see versions of the Platform 2 complex, seen them before, but at a larger scale. We're going to be looking very intensively right at the center portion of this photograph. And every time you see one of these dotted squares, such as these that flank the staircase, these are oyos. These are stone-lined pits going down. It's very key architectural circumstance. So this we could take as a starting point. We might be looking as early as 800 BC calibrated here at our starting point, and we're going to be ending about 500. But at this point, the gallery of the Esplanade is still in use. The gallery plaza around it, which is fronted very neatly by these platforms. This plaza area is not flagged. It doesn't have a stone surface, as it will later. Here we can see the excavation done, anticipating the use of the small half gallery that I mentioned, this rather enigmatic form that I had mentioned just a few seconds ago. So going down, platforms are expanding, these oyos are being built. And now, at this point, we have the earliest use of the half gallery, which has been installed over that sub-excavation. And a series of structures, staircases, are being built out in this area. They include their own oyos within them as well. Continuing on in time, new platforms are built. Canals are routed into the area. We know this is a underground, lightly underground, small scale canal, probably coming through this corridor, but it's not the same canal as one that later will do that. Canals are being built close to the face, the major facade of Building C, running along it, and canals are being built into the areas surrounding the platforms. These canals are routing water towards Building C, not away from it. So they're not efficient drainage canals. They're canals moving water towards construction you'd want to keep it away from. They're probably dropping down into an earlier canal system, built earlier, maintained, that is gradually dropping down, and by the time we're excavating the highest Chavin levels, that canal already has its floor down around 3 to 4 meters below ground surface. These surface canals, to some degree, are dropping into those large-scale underground conduits canals themselves. Now, This area here, labeled as Recinto Dos, does become precisely that, a structure, a clear room of some sort, with all sorts of interesting details unto itself. And I want to take a second and look at that structure. Hopefully this will be displaying for you. It's our obvious Agisoft 3D model, photogrammetric 3D model. And this is indeed that Recinto Dos. And it has features of great importance, including being obviously plastered very well. It's a very finished structure. It actually has a molding at the base of that structure, the wall here, having an inset, a few centimeters of inset, very common in form to moldings that we typically build in our own architecture. We have the wall to the south being a wall with no stone included. There's a large slate slab right here, but that has to do with prior things. This wall appears to be rammed earth, built into a structure that is otherwise field stone built and very finely plastered. We have replasterings of these surfaces, which are just delightfully preserved, and those floors can be peeled very, very handily when dry, but they can't when. So again, conservation led us to something quite interesting. If we go into a space which was delimited by this building of the west wall of this structure, we can look behind that wall and we can see two square areas emerging. These are stone mine pits, beautifully squared and going down to an earlier surface. They have been sealed off themselves and were no longer visible at the time this room was in use. So there's a long sequence of accessing and then losing access to prior structures. But the overall impression that we get from excavating this very well preserved structure is that it is the product of the evolution of a series of walls that are built into this area. The form, the exact shape of this structure changes over time, becomes increasingly delimited and restricted in size, but very, very complex in its growth and development. Just another step in this process. As time goes on, these larger walls delimiting the platform surface, the platform is just hardly above ground surface by this point because of the rise in ground surface. At this point, the gallery of the Esplanade is closed. This small foyer goes down, keeps track of its position. Canals are rerouted. New canals come from this area. Curbstones are installed in a black and white patterning. They're cut stone, limestone, and granite, very much as the black and white symbolism in other parts of the site. And as we keep going, now the floor is flagged with black slate. The floor of the plaza, that is flagged with black slate. New platform is built to one side of it. This isn't supposed to make any particular sense. It's just observing. Rectangular building is built to the south, forming this up as a much more delimited plaza than it had been, although the plaza it was. New canals have come in running along the face of building C, and delimiting walls come to their outside, making that whole area apparently invisible to anybody in this corridor or probably on the platform. Notice what this whole thing is doing. It's building up major architecture in front of the monumental facade of Building C. You might say it is beginning to diminish the imposing character of that facade, but we have to remember that Building C over this time is also building itself up in 2.5-meter jumps as new galleries are being incorporated into that mass. So the whole ground surface is rising, corresponding to some of this deeply buried condition that I referred to in the main part of my lecture. Okay, and then just some last final things. Some rather sizable pits are dug within the Chavin period going down into these spaces. Some of them are stone lined, some of them are not. They are much larger scale than what we've seen thus far, and some of them are considerably deeper. We continue to be mystified by what these are. We're actually still working on some of them at this juncture. The very complex organization of the construction vents and their compounded moments can be seen here. And I'm not going to try to make sense out of this, but to give you a sense, this is just a rudimentary outline of what for each one of these moments represents, in many cases, dozens of construction activities, some contemporary, many sequential within each moment. Since we're dealing with about 300 years of time here, when we start breaking our moments down into fifths, perhaps even smaller segments, we're dealing with very small slices. Not too small, however, to register continued construction and reconstruction in a site who we've tended to characterize by big construction events, whose cycle from construction through use to subsequent construction may have been on the order of 3 years. Now, we're finding that each of those 300 years, when we have adequate situation, is capable of being resolved at a similar level of subdivision, but obviously with a new order of magnitude scale of time fineness. It's very spectacular, and we will be doing a great deal of Bayesian modeling on radiocarbon, although in many of these excavations we find almost no radiocarbon to work with. There are no samples to work with. But we're going to be trying very hard to see what we can do to resolve time. So to conclude, I want to go through some ideas that help explain what's going on here. Titling this Ancestor Architecture, because I think architecture was ancestral here. In other words, there is something, a derivation, an evolution, lineage of architecture in many different areas that is, I think, quite equivalent to the type of ancestrality that we've spent so much attention on looking at. The real question is, these things that are being seen from the past, what was this? Are we talking about some form of memory? At first, I was quite enchanted with that idea because it was very current some time ago, worrying about memory this and memory that. I'm now thinking that that's a crutch, and a poor one, because I don't think this is so much memory as real-time transgression. In other words, you're not making reference or respecting the past. You're maintaining the past alive today. You say, well, yeah, that's kind of like, say, the mummified Sapa Incas who never died. Well, they were never allowed to die. That's what we're really looking at. This access to the past, so regularly and frequently done, is something that is being quite willfully maintained and it's being maintained real time. This isn't the loss and then rediscovery. This isn't the referential memorizing or memory dump or, oh, I remember something about that. No, this is something that is in the present, much as the Inca mummies were in the present. It raises this fascinating issue, I think, of whether the South Incas were allowed. We think, oh, they wanted to live on. They had their royal estates to administer, etc. Yeah, well, the royal estate wants that, that's for sure. It's not so clear that was ever the will of that particular individual. Something to consider. Now, this brings up the idea. When is the present free from the past? In Chavin, I think it abundantly is not free from the past. It depends on the past because the things that Chavin is doing over centuries and other sites parallel to Chavin were doing, and probably sites like Caral were in their own way doing before, references the past. It has to reference the past. It depends on tradition. Tradition is what justifies these rather radical changes that are coming. And he said, well, tradition, radical change, what? Yes, they're using the visibility of the past as both an ancestral thing, saying we are derived from that, but they're also saying it was much like what we are today. And we observe it. We haven't left it behind. We're not being radical. You shouldn't feel uncomfortable that we are making things much bigger, making things much grander, much more labor intensive, cut stone, et cetera, et cetera. This is really part and parcel of what's coming out of our traditions. And I think for the formative, that is an incredibly important part of what's going on. At the same time, is the past free from the present? No, the past is being reworked in that same sense. It is being determined. Those Inca mummies were being run. They were, I don't believe they were willfully being ambassadors, that they were willfully supervising ceremonies and such. I believe they're dead. That's my personal belief. I honestly believe that the Inca who ran those mummies knew quite well they were dead. That raises a greater question we're going to get to in a second of true believers. So, at any rate, this keeping at hand, live support system for the present, using the past actively, not so much as the past, but really just as confirmation of the present, I think is written all over Chavin. Now, within this context, we're dealing with Chavin as a secretive organization. I started the talk with this, and the title itself talks about a secretive site. Well, it is. Much of what happened at Chavin happened within very small space, if not subsurface space, invisible space to anybody who isn't there. So while there are larger spaces, the Plaza Mayor is quite impressive. As I've argued before, it doesn't show signs of intensive use. The staircase stones, granted, confessedly, but they don't show highly eroded or walked on surfaces. Thousands of people weren't present in those spaces. Small scale offerings, small scale debris in the plazas that we've excavated. It's not there. The offerings are big, they're major, they're very intentionally placed, they're spectacular. Don't see a lot of evidence, even the little tucked into cracks evidence, which you would expect to see if large numbers of people of modest means were using these spaces. It really looks like we're dealing with, for the ultimate rituality, the use of very small spaces by very small numbers of people, but over very long and consistent periods of time. These galleries, spaces like we're seeing in the North Esplanade, it's not for lack of activity, but all the signs where we see intensive activity are small spaces. They're not big. They're constantly under modification. Both the galleries and these esplanade-like areas are being rebuilt, constantly modified. Now, I will argue that it's secretive in the sense that it would be unlikely that people visiting the site, making pilgrimages, if you will, but coming for various ritual functions, various ideological needs, very unlikely that they would have fully comprehended a very large percentage of what was going on at Chavin because of the large number of contemporarily utilized small spaces. It gives a sense that Chavin was in charge of a corpus of ritual activity, knowledge, ideas, information for sure. But that was not something you mastered easily, if at all. It may not have been something that anybody within the society fully comprehended. And this is important because it starts to sound like things akin to perhaps a slightly more complex organization, not unlike the American Southwest in Pueblo ritualism, in which the sum of all the parts doesn't necessarily make any sense at all. It's the parts working together, coordinating, integrating, that is probably more important. And therefore, probably no one, in my opinion, controlled all the knowledge at Chavin, making it a very, very complex operation. Now, something that I cannot avoid thinking about is horizons. Chavin would have been horrified of horizons. Why? Because if you have some form of a secretive society, whether it's a classic secret society or not, the last thing you want is to be imitated. Last thing you want is for somebody else to be able to duplicate what you do, because what you do is you, so long as it's not others. It's definitionally important here. So the idea of the spread of very common material culture, ritual activity, identicality would have been avoided. I think Chavin is evolving its ritualism over time in a very intentional fashion to get away from things that have been duplicated. And things do get duplicated. I have no doubt about that. Could Chavin have been important enough within the overall complex of a very large-scale interaction sphere to have drawn particular attention and particular duplication? Possibly. In that sense, is it a horizon? Well, wow, I don't know. It certainly isn't as simple as we would have envisioned, just simply radiating influences, if you will. I think there's a lot of intentionality here, and I think there would have been a lot of intentionality to keep ahead of the Joneses within the competitive frame of ritual centers who are under different leaderships, right? Depend on contributions from, in the end, the same contributing population. At any rate. Now, just to, upon departure, acknowledge this basic idea that I've been working on since starting at Chavin of the development of authority, the evolution of authority. This graphic which contrasts possible routes to authority through self-interest and disinterest, or something along the lines of altruism. It's a stereotypic distinction, which has all the fallacies and problems of doing that type of activity. I would make it somewhat more complex by looking at something along these lines. Self-interest, system service on the left-hand side, sort of now turned 90 degrees and thrown these. And if this was what was going on, then what characterized the system? And for leadership, which is primarily servicing the system, it suggests that the leaders themselves believe highly down to the detail in what they're doing. They don't have to. They may be even using duplicity or artifice, related but obviously not the same concepts, to achieve their service, their improvements to that cultural milieu in which they operate. But we probably give them a greater chance of being true believers. If we have people operating from self-interest, it's hard to believe that they're true believers in what they're promulgating, because they're not in it for anyone but themselves. So they're probably, perhaps not totally necessarily, using some form of duplicity, at least artifice, a very concentrated development of the concepts and actions involved. So, are these really what we can use to define what's going on in Chavin? I'm not so sure. I want to bring in another concept, and that coming out of our comic book that Miguel drew, some of you may have seen, very luxuriously illustrated thing. What I'm going to just simply call barbarism, in semi-reference to Morgan, but rather trying to now get at the sense of who were these people and on what basis did they act? Their self-interest, system serving, those sorts of things. But what sort of creatures were they? Were they barbarians? Did they do barbaric things? Or were they sophisticated? Somehow you want to know this type of thing. It's very non-objective type of inquiry, but I think there's still something important there. So was Chavin voluntary or despotic? Were these convincers trying to make sophisticated arguments, or were they, with their consuming population, who I happen to believe were mostly secondary elite, both from their own organizations and from distant organizations, or were they coercers? Well, weaponry is present in Chavin. It's illustrated in Chavin from certainly the beginnings of the black and white phase, although we don't have much real true illustration before that time. Weapons are there, physically found in the site, but they appear with a greater frequency towards the end. And they never are in the first plane. Military figures are always in the back plane. Weapons are rarely displayed in what you would call a really evident and first plane mode. Similarly, we don't have any major tombs at Chavin, that's for sure, but we haven't seen otherwise any evidence for massive personal wealth accumulation. We have for architectural investment in structures which we believe belong to people of some rank, where those structures were built to very high energy standards. A lot of energy was invested in them. But I haven't seen wealth accumulation. So self-interest, maybe, but then where is all the self-interest going to? Where are the monuments people built to themselves? We don't seem to see individual human beings recognized in the graphic Chavin art. Maybe we just can't read it right, but it doesn't seem to have that level of specificity. We don't see glyphs marking individuals, naming them. So it suggests that it's not an individual thing, but the idea of lineages with particularly strategized way of dealing with people and integrating them into ruling structures, this radical formative shift. Something along those lines seems more like it. Self-interest and aggrandizement seems likely that there was at least some of that going on. But they were not displaying it for the most part. If they are, it's based on some sort of a communal level of well-dressedness, carrying weaponness, carrying ceremonial itemsness, etc. Those things may well have belonged to a segment of the society. I hesitate to call it a class, but maybe it's not too far off. So on one hand, we don't see huge evidence for this level of power and authority in the hands of an individual, or maybe in the hands of very few. On the other hand, if we go to the other side, I fervently believe that Chavin was not a theme park. This wasn't a place where you came for self-fulfillment as any individual in society without a prior appointment, without prior substantial offering to make, etc. Chavin was highly programmed. Chavin was highly structured. You couldn't gain access to these spaces just by feeling like it. And this suggests then that there still was quite a bit of authority being invested in those who ran, organized, designed, and then administrated the system. So, highly structured, rapidly and frequently mobilized, by which I mean to say it's not static. They are definitely responding to all sorts of signals about how they can do things effectively. It's historically conscious in that sense. I don't think you would have the type of developments you see at Chavin if the people were not aware of the success and failure of the different ways that they tried to work with human nature in the converts to the cult who came in. The very success of Chavin was dependent on a material flow. Inputs had to be given, raw materials, labor, etc. This had to come in. So there is a success and there is a failure. And the success is going to come with increasingly more effective ways of convincing people of the authority and validity of the Chavin system. I see that that is an incredibly sophisticated, developing system of knowledge, especially knowledge of how to work within the limitations of tradition and to promote its possibilities, to work with the confidences that the past and reference to it and demonstration of it and living with it give. So in sum, I think Chavin found itself, as did many other people in the formative period, both privileged by new possibilities, but problematized by working within a tradition-bound system, really at a crossroads in human reorganization. And that the formative, therefore, takes its rightful mode as an eminently important period in the Peruvian past. And it just doesn't fit my definition of barbarism. So thank you very much for your attention. I will finally be quiet, and I appreciate anyone who's taken the time to work through both halves of this talk, and would appreciate people feeding back to me, easily found at johnrick@stanford.edu. And I would love to engage in further conversations with anyone interested in seeing parallel or not so parallel things going on in the formative or the early Andes in general. Thanks so much.